All right. So I want to welcome everyone to our Citizens for Global Solutions World Citizen Book Club. Today is Saturday, June 28th, and my name is Hannah Fields, and I am the Communications Officer at CGS, and I'm your moderator for today's book club. And I am so pleased to see you all here today and to welcome you here. And we are recording today's session, and an abridged video of the session will be made available on CGS's YouTube channel and our website. And I would like to remind everyone that while book club is an open forum for discussion, we want authors to be able to speak frankly and where appropriate to be able to do so off the record.
The future itself, and the future was already moving forward.
I think I hear something in the background. So
While Camilla plotted in hushed chambers,
gonna
Prince William stepped into a calm clarity that startled even his close.
Sorry about that. Um, so as I was saying, we do want authors to speak frankly and where appropriate and to be able to do so off the record. So we therefore do not allow any AI assistants to record the session, and I'll disable any AI note takers that are activated. And if this is your first time and you would like to be kept informed about upcoming book club sessions, please drop a message in the chat and I will add you to our group email. And today is the second of three sessions on the Humble Cosmopolitan Rights, Diversity, and Trans-State Democracy by Professor Luis Cabrera. And Luis joins us today as we cover chapters 4 to 6. And if you haven't already done so, you can buy the book from Amazon, and I'll put the link in the chat once I have concluded this introduction. And before we begin, I'll take us through housekeeping. So firstly, excuse my dog. Firstly, to ensure um, Firstly, to ensure that everyone has a chance to join, I ask everyone to keep their questions or comments to 2 minutes. If you exceed that time, I will interject and ask you to wrap up so that everyone has an opportunity to speak. And once everyone who is interested has had the opportunity to ask a question or make a comment, I will open the floor to further discussion with a second round of questions and comments. So does anyone object to the community agreement for the Q&A? Thank you. You can raise your hands virtually or physically and put your questions in the chat. I'll come to you on a first come, first served basis. We'll stop at about 10 minutes before the end of the session at around 8:20 for any announcements people may wish to make about relevant events or things they want to promote. And please therefore hold on to any comments you may have that are not related to book club until the end, or you can put them in the chat at any time. With the housekeeping over, it is my pleasure to introduce the author of The Humble Cosmopolitan and today's speaker, Professor Cabrera. Luis Cabrera is a professor of political science at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. His research has focused on the theories and practices of democracy, human rights, and regional and global citizenship. He has authored 3 books and edited or co-edited 3 others, besides publishing more than 40 journal articles and book chapters. His most recent monograph, published in 2020, is The Humble Cosmopolitan, which we will discuss in our 3 sessions. With that said, it is now my pleasure to hand it over to Luis, and Luis, take us away. I can't hear your audio, Luis. It's not showing that you're muted. Is your microphone are you using a plugged in microphone, perhaps? Um,
Is that
I
any?
might, oh, there you are. Yeah, great.
Okay. It was just, it wanted to be clicked on some other setting. Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Hannah, for the introduction. I thought I might just refresh myself on the table of contents and explain what I was trying to do in this middle section of the book, and then just open it up. So last time we talked about some of the foundational theoretical things I was trying to do. So the whole book is trying to answer these sort of arrogance and neo-imperialism objections against world government, really. It's world government is this sort of Western imposition. It's cooked up in Western societies. It's just this extension of some sort of human rights or Christianity doctrine that doesn't fit on other societies, and is world government activists are trying to impose it on those societies. So what I tried to do in this book was go speak to and learn from people in other societies, non-Western societies, specifically India in this case, about why they were using human rights language, some of the activists. So I settled on the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights, why they were using human rights language, what it meant to them, what their opponents were saying, and the sources from which they drew nourishment. And that led me to B.R. Ambedkar, the great anti-caste champion, Dalit rights champion of the early and middle part of the 20th centuries. And so you'll see that he's all over the book. So I draw a lot of insight from him because his struggle was in some ways the struggle that I've tried to join, which is for universal human rights in a way that's firm but also sensitive to local belongings, to local beliefs. And I think he does pretty well with it. He created a constitutional structure, or led the creation of a constitutional structure in which rights are foregrounded, but there's also autonomy in various ways for local communities. So in this middle section, so can you remind me, are we doing 4, 5, and 6, or 5, 6, and 7, the chapters?
4, 5, and 6.
Okay, so in chapter 4, I looked at the foundational argument for democracy, because when you're talking about some other societies, certainly in the part of the world I currently live in, just to the north here in Southeast Asia, 8 out of the 10 countries are not democracies. And if you go to these ASEAN meetings, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you'll hear people make the case against democracy. It's, they say we need a political system that promotes harmony, not dissensus, not dissension. So I felt like if you're going to make the case for a global democracy, you've got to make the case for democracy first. And Ambedkar gives us a lot of resources there. So I looked at some of the foundational arguments for democracy, why democracy is justifiable as a political system, and I compared those to Ambedkar's account. And my takeaway is very much an Ambedkarian inspired account, which is that the primary justification for democracy is that it's the system that best promotes individual rights. It doesn't always do it, but it does the least bad job of it. So it's not a system that will necessarily promote equality. It's not a system that will necessarily promote autonomy, individual autonomy and freedom. Those are the other two sort of, I guess, primary justifications that people would use, or most prominent justifications. And the problem is that you're always going to have persistent minorities. So if you think of the Greens Party in the United States, they're not an ethnic minority, they're not a religious minority, but they're a persistent ideological minority. And with very few exceptions, the Greens are not going to see their interests reflected in elections or in policy, in the United States, in many other countries. Some countries, the Greens do fairly well, but in the United States, the Greens are a persistent electoral minority. So if we claim that democracy is justified because it promotes individual autonomy, well, if you're a Greens Party member, you're watching other parties get elected consistently over time, over the decades, and your preferences are not reflected in the policy that comes out. So it's hard to say that democracy has promoted freedom for you. What it does overall, it's strongly correlated with individual rights. So the more democratic, the more constitutionally democratic, liberal democratic, if you like, a system is, with checks and balances, separation of power, an independent judiciary, the more it promotes and advances basic individual rights. So, bodily integrity, people not being dragged off the streets and put away in horrendous conditions. We're seeing great slippage in US democracy right now, and in democracies around the world. India has seen that too in the time that I was visiting it from 2010 to 2016. The hard right was ascendant and took power nationally, and so you've seen some of the same moves. But that's chapter 4, and then chapter 5 is where I begin to bring in the field research. So this is where I talk about what the Dalit activists taught me. And I spent, I think I went to India 16 times to speak to these Dalit activists all around the country. And Dalit, I think I mentioned last time, used to be called untouchable. So Ambedkar always uses the word untouchable. But Dalit is certainly the term that most of the activist groups choose to use. So I was looking for their arguments against their opposition about why they use universal human rights language, why they reject a system that the government in power, the BJP, the hard right BJP, would say is the Indian system, which is more like the caste system. The BJP does not openly advocate the caste system, but certainly they advocate what they call traditional Hindu values, their interpretation of traditional Hindu values, in which the caste system is central. And if you look at the writings of their foundational figures, they're very much defend the caste system. And then when you begin to talk to people, they will defend harmony. Again, this idea of harmony. So the idea was that the caste system promotes harmony. They won't openly defend the caste system, but they'll say, no, we want harmony. And these people are hurting India. They're trying to break India with their claims of human rights violation, with their criticisms, and they should promote harmony instead. They should realize that they live in one of the freest societies in the world. So I spoke to Dalit activists all over the country. I, with a colleague, spoke to about 18 or 20 BJP figures around Delhi and got their ideas, everyone from the transportation minister to fairly mid to senior people, because I wanted to hear from the people who are making the BJP policy, setting the norms that the BJP expects its followers to adhere to, and learned a lot about how they make their arguments. They say, the Dalit activists will say, no, we are not trying to break India. We are trying to, fulfill the promise of India. We are people of the soil. We're the people who build India, and we just want to be treated fairly and equally. We want our rights, the rights that are guaranteed to them in the Indian Constitution, and the rights that are present in major human rights treaties at the UN. So one of the things they did from about 1999 was send delegates to the major UN human rights bodies to try to enlist allies to pressure the Indian government to do more against caste discrimination, which is still a very significant issue in India. And they had some successes. They would not say it was an utter success, because the Indian government's very powerful. There was one moment where they had gotten 13 or 14 countries that were ready to sign on to a declaration that I believe this one was that caste should be included, or should be understood to be covered under the major anti-discrimination treaty that so many countries have signed on to. And then basically overnight, the Indian government contacted all these countries and told them, if you want to continue to trade with us, et cetera, you won't sign this declaration. And come the moment, and only Switzerland was willing to sign the declaration. So they were facing that kind of struggle, and I was interested to hear how they respond to their critics. And their critics are very vigorous, very vocal. I mean, there are big best-selling books in India, all containing these criticisms, pressing these criticisms, saying that the activists are not fighting for India. They're trying to break India. They're trying to make India look bad. They're anti-national. That's a big one. So we're hearing some of that rhetoric in other places too. If you don't go along with the government, you're not a patriot. You're treasonous. So we've had a former president just accused of treason. And then in chapter 6, I was trying to look at the current system and saying that it is not a more integrated system, a global democracy, a world government that would be arrogant. It's actually the current system that's arrogant and allows states to take advantage of the current human rights norms to do not anything they want to do, but gives them a lot of leeway. So what I've argued is it's the sovereign state system that's fundamentally arrogant. So states, the human rights regime, the treaties guarantee or declare that all individuals have a really impressive schedule of rights. I mean, everything to paid vacation, you know, so you'd want to live in the society, I think, that's outlined in those human rights treaties. You'd probably feel pretty comfortable that you're going to be able to make your way in it. And when it gets to the state level, however, the system puts states in charge of affirming and protecting and advancing the human rights of their own individual citizens with predictable results. So some states do a pretty good job of that. Other states do not. And they will say, no, we're a sovereign state. We have the right, you know, who are you? UN Special Rapporteur on torture, for example, that happened in Australia. The government at that time, um, the prime minister said to the special rapporteur on torture, who was looking at some of these offshore islands where Australia was keeping people who had tried to get into the country by boat, and looking at the conditions and saying this actually violates some torture treaties. And the prime minister at the time, Tony Abbott, said, "Who is the UN to come and talk to us about this? Australia is a modern democracy. We protect individual rights better than just about any other country. We don't have to listen to the UN." And that's what I'm saying is wrong with the current system. I'm sure I don't have to tell that to this audience, but you know, states are empowered to say, we don't have to listen to you. We don't accept your criticism, and we're not going to do anything about it. And again and again and again, we see states doing that. We see the US under the previous Trump administration pulling out of the major UN human rights body. So what I was trying to establish in chapter 6 is that it's the current system that is arrogant, that in Ambedkar's term would allow governments to be imperialist against their own people. Ambedkar talked about an empire of the Hindus, and of course the Hindus are 80% of India's population. So in his mind, the powerful Hindus were able to impose their will on minorities such as Dalits. He didn't spend as much time as some others talking about Muslims, but that would be the case as well. And so what I'm saying is actually we're seeing an empire of governments able to impose their will. We're not seeing the kind of global system that would actually advance individual rights. And so in the last section of the book, which I guess we'll take up next time, I talk about the kind of system that could actually reliably promote rights. And I'll tell you, since I wrote that, knowing what we now know about how a very robust democratic system can actually be subverted, I'll probably, in the next book, which I'm writing now, change a few things up, change a few prescriptions, be a little more defensive. Because, you know, if it can happen to the United States, which used to be, you know, you look at all those treatises in the 1940s, they're saying, we need a United States for the world. We've proved that democracy is the greatest thing ever. We need a US-style democracy for the entire world. I don't think we can, say that with as little with no caveats, if we ever could. So I think we have to be very cautious now about the kind of system we advocate, and the kind of safeguards we'd want to put into it. You know, you can never be completely safe, but you know, if it can happen in the United States, as I'm hearing from people around the world, you know, who knows what can happen. So that's where I'm at right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cabrera. I can open the floor to any questions that you may have, that anyone may have. Just a reminder, just to keep your question to about 2 minutes, and you can either raise your hand, raise your virtual hand, or put your question in the chat. And I see Joseph, your hand is up, so I'll go with you first.
Thank you, Louis, Professor Cabrera. I read this book because I know your work as a kind of indirect and very subtle dispute with the state sovereign state sovereignty system. And I imagine that Ambedkar would be a very good example of someone who was poor and a minority, like a Dalit and like W.E. Du Bois in the United States, a minority. And he struggled against this sovereign state system, starting with India, and then involving all countries, really. And I noticed, well, one thing that I'd like to go back to ask you a very prior question. We can go into the distinction between humility and arrogance. Really, I would like to, because it seems a little different than what I understand, the way you present it. But you say on page 6, you announce that this is just a typical passage. You announce that the core of my approach is that it attaches no primary or ultimate moral significance to states, nations, or other social groups. And so this is your book is, as is repeatedly said, is quite plain and defensive about a supranational order. And so I wondered why you didn't end up like so many international relations theorists, like this man that you mentioned in the 2 pages before of Bernard Yack, who says on page 8, um, he opposes, quote, an older and more arrogant vision of cosmopolitan political organization with its frightening images of a world state and a world sovereign. So this is a fair contest that you are entering, and you're a rare scholar, really, who defends the supranational perspective. And so I wondered, how did you start? Why, even when you were based in Britain, and you wrote an earlier book called Global Governance, Global Government, why did you take up this supra-sovereign perspective? Did you read one of these classics from the old world federalist movement like Clarence Stright's Union Now? Or did you read Mortimer Adler, How to Think About War and Peace? You must have been convinced that world government is not irrational or destructive, but offered great hope to humanity. What was the beginning? I mean,
No, thank you for that question. That's a great question. The beginning for me was human rights, universal human rights. And then as you start to think through those, I was drawn to this cosmopolitan moral theory, which is very close to global citizenship. I don't think I don't think the two need to be distinguished really when you're talking about moral cosmopolitan and moral global citizenship. And the more I read into those, where it's fundamentally focused on ensuring that the rights or needs of all persons are met. Very quickly into that journey, I started thinking, well, what about the institutions? We don't expect political institutions within the state to simply say, declare that everyone's rights should be met and then not take steps to do that. So it's a Madisonian sort of idea, I guess, that you need a central government, a central power that's capable of actually affecting policy. And so that led me to people like Derek Heater, the historian of world citizenship and world government, and Wesley Woolley, same sort of person. And then I found your work a little later, Professor Barata, but suddenly realizing what I hadn't known, that there was this incredible movement in the 1940s, 30s, and 40s for world government. So I started reading some of the people you mentioned and started realizing that there was this long historical trajectory to these sorts of ideas, and that as I was writing, these ideas were being revived, or perhaps rediscovered by cosmopolitans, such as Thomas Pogge, who is mentioned in there. But they didn't typically harken back to the 1940s authors, for their own reasons. These folks always wanted to distance themselves from world government. And I guess I was unusual in that I said, no, we need to be talking about world government. What we're talking about is the need for a world government, and we shouldn't be shy about that. So my thesis was subtitled A Cosmopolitan Case for the World State. And it was challenging. I had a prominent political scientist, international relations scholar, who my supervisor had asked to be on my committee. And he said he didn't think it was responsible to let a student write about world government, because it just was such an out there idea, such a fringe idea. And so he refused to be on the panel. Now, I will say that a few years later, when Alexander Wendt, the international relations scholar, very, very big wig, came out with an argument that world state is inevitable, this gentleman wrote back to me and said, "Well, I guess you were right. I guess I guess it was okay to write about world government." But it was important to me to say, look, let's nail our colors back to the mast. This is what we're talking about. The time seems auspicious, in the early 90s, the mid 90s, to talk about these things again. These things seem possible. It's, more world government, not full federal world government right away, but advancing more world government seems possible. Let's start talking about this. So I made the case that cosmopolitans, people who believe that everyone should have their universal rights or their universal needs met, regardless of nationality, should also be institutional cosmopolitans. They should be advocating for some form of world government that could actually get that done. So that was my journey early on. And then ever since, I've been trying to fill in pieces of that. And then the next book is all about getting to world government, how we actually, look at the paths that people have outlined and tried to follow in the past, and then look at where we might go from where we are. And my current thought is that it might not seem auspicious right now, but we sure can see the need for more decent institutions to reinforce state democracy and everything else. So, this is the gift of Trump once again.
Thank you.
Next, we'll go to Evan, and then we'll go to you, Bob.
Yeah, hi. I very much enjoyed your discussion of the methodological issues in Chapter 5, Grounded Normative Theory. And I think that is an important pursuit, for which at times people must have great faith to pursue. But my question at the moment is, you use the term arrogance a lot, arrogance of authority, power. It's a loaded term, and it assumes, I think, a violation of entitlement of some kind to individual agency. So where does the entitlement to individual agency come from, at least in the Indian context?
No, very good question. And that's why, those sorts of questions were why it was so important for me to write this book. And so in the chapters we dealt with last time, chapter 2 especially, and then chapter 3, I went all the way down to the basics, because there are serious philosophers who these days will argue that human moral equality doesn't make any sense. Humans aren't equal on other qualities, and just this idea that humans have some capacity or character that makes them all equal in some significant way, that means they should all be treated equally, doesn't make any sense. So I had to go all the way to the foundations. And again, I drew on Ambedkar because he was making these arguments against people who thought that Dalits were unequal by religious fate. They in a past life they had done something terrible that got them reincarnated as a Dalit. So he was fighting against the doctrine of karma. He was fighting against doctrines that said that Dalits were naturally in that place. They were not equipped as human beings to be any higher. And he made some of the same categories of argument that you'll find John Stuart Mill and Harriet Mill making against these arguments in the 1800s, that women were inherently unequal. So I made the case for high moral equality based not only on human capacities, even when they're not fully realized, but also on other variables. And then from that, made the case for individual rights. And one of those rights is an ability to protect your own rights, to give input, to give standing. And that's where we come upon the case for democracy. So democracy, being able to give input, being able to check power, becomes one of the ways in which you can protect and advance your own rights. Now, there's not a full categorical human right to democracy, but what I'm arguing is that democracy does so much better than other systems at advancing and protecting rights that we can treat it as though there were a right to it. So that's where I'm coming from with that. And I'm just fighting the same battle in some ways that Ambedkar had to fight, which is for the most basic equality, for the most basic rights. And it might not be persuasive to those in power who want to reject democracy and equality and universal rights. It wasn't for Ambedkar either, but he fought the battle and eventually got those enshrined into the Constitution.
Thank you.
You. Now we'll go over to you, Bob.
Sure. Well, I'm very interested in public education and informing the public about these ideas, or you could call it marketing if you want to be more crude. But the way this has been put out in the past to the public is often that this is a way to abolish war or prevent World War III or what have you at its origins. And more recently, with the environmental calamities that we're facing, it's a way to, ensure a sustainable environment. But, human rights has kind of always been there in the background. People have talked about it. The movement has worked in it. But it's never been kind of the front and center thing, at least from, my perception. And it's certainly not in the presentations that I give. And what I must say, your book and what you said last week have been kind of mind-blowing as another way, kind of, the what to put forward. Because, who's going to argue about having their own rights, or having their own rights, So I'm just wondering, how have you been received? I guess I'm assuming you've also done kind of public presentations in addition to us who are steeped in this. How has this been received in for those audiences and those circles? If you can speak to that, because I'm thinking about how to change my PowerPoint, and all that I give because of what you're saying, because it does seem very powerful. So I would just, anything you can say about that, I'd appreciate hearing. Thank you.
Great. Oh, no, amazing question. And in fact, I've been thinking very much about this because I've been going back to the 1940s and before to look at some of the Indian thinkers, because my whole journey has been about realizing how little I know, and being mad with my slightly younger self for not knowing things. How could you not know that Nehru and Gandhi were such, vocal advocates of world government? Well, because that book wasn't really written until 2012. So I've gone back recently. So I've got an article that's coming out any day now, probably next week, and it looks at those Indian visions of world government. And one thing about the Indian visions, especially the Nehru Gandhi vision, is that it's all about global justice. So Nehru talked about ending wars, but really he was concerned about anti-imperialism. So he saw world government as a way to prevent the kind of imperialism to which India had been subjected for so long by Britain. And he saw world government, he and Gandhi saw world government as a way to prioritize the interests of the worst off globally. So, he was earlier in his career, he was in the international socialist movement. And so he would go to international events. And at a couple of those, he told them, we need to all join together. And he saw world government as a way of joining together and promoting this sort of democratic socialism or democratic developmental democracy. So social issues, poverty, development was always foregrounded, and individual rights was always foregrounded in this tradition. Gandhi talked about duties a lot more than rights, but for Nehru, it was always about prioritizing the interests of the worst off. The only place you really saw that back in the 1940s, well, I won't say only because somebody will tell me about another one, but the most prominent place you saw that was in the Chicago Committee's Constitution, the preliminary draft of a world constitution, and it talked about what was it? Maximize or doing as much as possible about global poverty. It was very vague. Whereas you look at the Quit India Resolution, which was the major statement, the demand for independence finally by the Indian activists in 1942, and got them all put in jail again. It says all of the world's resources should be pooled and priority should be given to the worst off. So it's a very different way of thinking about the case for world government. And for me, the reason I haven't foregrounded the security case is while, yes, nuclear weapons are as scary as anything, I was persuaded by Jean Monnet, the architect of the European Union, who said that if you begin with security, if you begin with sovereignty, everyone will just rattle their sabers and nothing will get done. So he sort of world government conspiracy theorists would say this is bad, but he sort of followed integration by stealth. He said, let's integrate the economies so they have real trouble fighting against each other. Let's integrate, then let's move toward political integration, and eventually it'll become unthinkable for them to declare war on one another. And arguably that's where we've arrived. Something is always thinkable, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, how do we advance that on a global level? I'm sorry, but I haven't read all those books yet. So that's the book I'm writing right now. But I think when you're talking about the messages to send, my hope is that hearkening back to Nehru and all those folks will do two things for us. It will show us that world government is not just something that was cooked up in the mind of Immanuel Kant, arguably, and all those who follow him from Europe and the United States. It was very much a global concern, and you see people in other developing countries who had that concern. And B, that it's not just about security; it's about everything that makes a human life livable.
Yeah. Well, certainly drawing on Gandhi and Nehru immediately dismisses the folks who say this is a Western thing or this is, whatever. So that's great in and of itself. So, okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm happy to circulate the article. I can send it to Hannah if you want to distribute it.
Yes, I can do that.
Great.
David, I see your hand up.
I think Carla May was before me.
Oh, did I miss? I'm sorry, I missed your hand,
I'm
Carla.
sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry, Hannah. My reactionary signal is not working. I can't get the hand to show on my screen. But what I like to say, Louis, thank you for a work such as yours because it gives us hope. And the question I bring is going back to that arrogance theme that is so prominent. Because I think what you're pointing out to us is the presence of what I would not call background music, but I would call background static. And that is the bias that causes the arrogance to reject such plans, dreams, expansions, possibilities that people like you present. And I think until we get serious in really calling that on the floor, people are going to continue to get away with it. And it's not that complicated. Arrogance takes four main forms in my estimation. And the first is my way is the highway, or individual egoism. Second form, group egoism. Our way is is the highway. And the third is, I don't even want to look at this because it's going to change something and I don't want things to change. And then finally, the most delicate of all the biases is trauma. And the fact that people are so wounded psycho-spiritually that they cannot accept the beauty of things presented, such as what you offer and others. We've got a Constitution for the Federation of Earth sitting on the desk of the United Nations. Why is it not being tended to? Why is it more important to put out brush fires? I can't answer those questions other than going back to the forms of arrogance and that you've recalled. We have got to begin, I think, to take care of interior obstacles as well as the inadequate forms of outer organization. But I thank you for bringing that up. I think it's kind of an elephant in the room, but I would appreciate your comment.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a great framework. That's really good. If you've written that, I'll be happy to cite you and talk about it in something. On you mentioned the United Nations. I was really interested that when I went back there, so I finally was able to get into that building after many tries. So I made a friend here in Australia who heads the UN United Nations Association, and I didn't do it just for this, but he was gracious enough to come up and speak to our students. And I said, hey, let's. He wanted to do this conference on disinformation. I said, hey, we'd be happy to host it. We brought it off and everything, and then he was really good about reciprocating and helping me make connections with people in the building on Turtle Bay there in Midtown New York. And so I was finally able to go do interviews in February and March, I think February of this year. And one of the things I was sort of gently asking them about world government, and one of the consistent messages was, we are not a world government. We don't talk about that because that's what the people who try to spread these conspiracy theories about the United Nations always say, that it's a world government, that it wants to control the world, it wants to rule the world. So they're in this weird sort of space where they're expected to do everything a world government would do, including stopping wars. But they're not given the powers of a world government to actually execute those things, to actually realize those aims. And they really, really don't want to be associated with a world government. So I guess I wouldn't be surprised to find out that that they immediately put the Constitution in a folder and just set it aside somewhere, because that would be, if they started talking about that in their mind, it would be very fraught. So that's kind of what we're dealing with these days. And it was an eye opener to get in there.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Bob, I didn't answer one of your questions. What has been the response to my work? My strategy is to be as dull and academic as humanly possible, so that it will be taken seriously. So I try to do the really hard spade work and dig into all the literature and intervene in the debates, and then show people in those dialogues how it actually connects to the things that I'm primarily interested in. So I've taken a slow and steady strategy, building up these arguments over time, and a few people have done that. I think Simon Caney is probably the smartest philosopher, smartest theorist working on these issues, and I'm just glad he hasn't done his big world government book yet, because it would be better than mine. But that's kind of how we're doing it. So the reception has been pretty good, I would say, pretty good. The stuff gets cited, it gets used.
That will go over to you, David.
Thank you, Professor. I've got a comment and two questions. The comment is over this issue of language. I think whenever we, as world federalists, talk about world government, that's when opponents then automatically think of trying to take over the world, and that's not what we're talking about. So I always think it's best to talk about democratic world federation and not use the term world government or world state. I think that's very confusing to many people. My two questions now, just before you mentioned it a few minutes ago, whenever I hear the word cosmopolitanism, I automatically think, because of my philosophy background, of Immanuel Kant, and you mentioned Kant just before. So my question is, what influence Kant had on your thinking on cosmopolitanism or world citizenship? Second question is how the UN is not democratic, and many world federalists explain why, because of the one nation, one vote in the General Assembly, and also because of the permanent members in the Security Council. I was wondering whether you have been influenced at all or know of the work of Joseph Schwartzberg, who tries to transform the United Nations system through weighted voting. So those are my two questions.
Thank you. Yeah, great intervention and questions. So on Kant, I found him very frustrating, actually, because and he's hard to get through for a So I like everybody did, I encountered him in grad school. So probably philosophy you would have read him as an undergrad, but I just came to him on my own without much background, and he was a little hard to penetrate. But I found the idea for a cosmopolitan history or for a global universal history with cosmopolitan intent, where he basically seems to be arguing for world government. I was nodding along the whole time, saying, "Oh yeah, this is great, this is great." And then by the time he gets to perpetual peace, he pulls back and says institutionally, what works well in theory won't work well in practice. So the best we can hope for is that you not kill the stranger when they're visiting your country. And that just seemed very, very disappointing. Now, others have taken Kant since and say, no, actually, we should read him as a world government scholar and everything else. So there's such a Kant industry that I've kind of let them do Kant. And I mention him. He also is very problematic, actually, for these lectures that he gave, the anthropology lectures, where he divided the world into superior and inferior races. And, so, okay, it was 1795, but still, come on, guy. So it's a little problematic to hitch your wagon too far to Kant. But certainly people have done some really good work on that, and I do engage it. And then I'm sorry, what was the second question? Just the theme?
About Schwartzberg and weighted voting.
Oh, right. Yes, I've got his book on my shelf. Very impressive. He was running the numbers and everything. And I think when you come right down to it, it's a tough question. So do we have to grit our teeth and just say, we're never going to get anything unless we again give concessions to the rich and powerful states? Or do we say, no, we don't want this thing until it can be a truly equally weighted voting? And I've been learning recently that this goes back so far, to the 1940s. And I come across several well-known people who are arguing that the problem with world government proposals, with global democracy proposals, is that the white races will never stand for it. And that's often how it's couched. So Hans Morgenthau, the great realist international relations scholar, his book was taught to 50 years worth of IR students in introductory courses up until the early 2000s. In his chapter on the world state, he gave a whole chapter to it and took it very seriously indeed. He says that global one person, one vote global democracy will be a non-starter because the white races will never agree to being under the domination of the more populous brown races, and the brown races will never agree to being dominated by the white races. So, he racialized the world in that way. And I guess in the 1940s, that must have been a typical way of thinking. Because I've come across that same claim before. And then so I worry a little bit when we start working out formulas that give, more power to the United States. But I guess it would also have to give it to China now too, which is a non-democracy. So I understand where he's coming from, and we may ultimately have to grit our teeth and go with that. But at what cost? And will it doom the enterprise in the way that arguably the UN was doomed, by the Security Council, which we can't seem to get rid of. But yeah, it's a good question. It's the question in some ways.
Go to you, Joseph.
Yes, thank you. I have a comment and then a question. Jean Monnet once wrote that for the hard work of uniting sovereignties, humanity will not act without a crisis. I highly recommend his memoirs because it's the best account, I think, of the formation of the European Union. That started when he persuaded the French foreign minister to propose a coal and steel community. I found in my studies that the delegations of sovereign powers to a regional or in principle world federation is fairly well demonstrated. Some 37 countries I found in their constitutions provide for the delegation of sovereign powers to a higher union. So sovereignty is not quite as rigid as it is usually described. Now, for my question, I worked to understand this book. I think it's a work of moral and political philosophy. But my main question is the distinction between humility and arrogance. And I found myself trying to find conventional expressions for what these are in your mind. And for instance, humility, you say at one point, is not deference.
Right.
It's not that kind of humble acceptance of inferiority. No, not at all. It's more like a firmness in the right. When I compare Ambedkar with Du Bois or Martin Luther King, those figures do not strike me as humble. They strike me as brave and firm in their sense of right.
Mhm.
In the case of Ambedkar, it was even harder than for King, because, as you know, he not only wanted to abolish untouchability, he wanted to abolish varna or color, caste. And in India, caste is very entrenched, and in other countries like the United States or Western European countries, why, indeed, there's no such thing as being born into a livelihood or some kind of a economic job. So we have it much more easy than Ambedkar had it, because he wanted to abolish something that was very deeply unequal. And I'm really impressed by your citations from all years of Ambedkar's work. One question that you never explain is, why in the world did the Indian government under Jawaharlal Nehru make Ambedkar the chief architect of the Constitution of 1950? This is, this should not be just passed over as curious. There must have been some kind of logic to this from the point of view of Nehru. So what I see you doing is giving us another language to describe the conflict between the sovereign state system, which is absolute power, and the human beings who claim rights principally of liberty. They don't claim But you are much more, you talk about justice and duty all the time. You are much broader. There's a quotation here on page 141 in the 6th chapter where you really explore the notion of world citizenship, even in the absence of a world state, to enforce it. And you write, the development of such institutions would not guarantee that all participants would actually adopt a disposition to political humility. Your term is not just humility, it's political humility, and sometimes cosmopolitan humility. You know, political humility or good domestic, regional, and global citizenship. So Ambedkar, you know, he fancied, this is truly astonishing, really, I think, in retrospect. He spoke as a global citizen. His firmness in the right was based upon his notion, I think, as you argue, that even in the absence of a world state, human beings belong to a global union. I don't know if you could add anything to that. I found that another old term for what you call humility is righteousness, a biblical term, you know, and the architects of rights, including the founders of the United States, they didn't think of themselves as humble. They thought of themselves as seizing what was theirs by birth. Jefferson said that all men are created equal. In the days of firm biblical belief, this was Thomas Paine writes this way too. The idea that God created us equal was very powerful, and it was used by the architects of the American Revolution, and I think by most of the Republicans in Europe, as being as amounting to liberty or freedom, which was given to us by the creation. And Ambedkar had that sense. He may be called a Dalit, but he was defiant and went to the United Nations even to abolish caste. And this gets him into a really big struggle, which you seized to enlarge your topic. I don't know, can you possibly say anything that might make humility and arrogance a little clearer?
Sure, I'll give it a go. There's a lot there. You're a careful reader, obviously a scholar, so citing page and verse there. So I agree, and in fact, in the book, I write that that Ambedkar and Du Bois are not themselves, they don't demonstrate the personal virtue of humility. So I say instead, they're agents of political humility. They're trying to put us into situations where we treat each others as equals, where we are humble to each others within political institutions, which would mean that we're willing to listen to the other, we're willing to give a fair hearing, and we feel obligated to offer our reasoned arguments, our good faith arguments to others, and to try to achieve agreement, or where agreement's not possible, at least to lay out our good faith reasons why that's so, and then let the political process operate in the way that it does. The Ambedkar and Du Bois both were called arrogant or uppity. So just as you had that awful trope of the uppity Negro back in segregation days. Anyone who stood up for themselves would be called uppity, and they would say, "Oh, you're getting above your station." The uppity Dalit was a similar trope. And Ambedkar exemplified it. Ambedkar said, I will not be treated as an inferior human being, and I will fight to my last breath so that Dalits are not treated as inferior human beings. What we want is a system that treats us equally. So my exemplar of political humility is actually Paul Divakar, the head of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, who is the one who was going to those UN institutions. That was his role in the organization. And they, he helped lead the delegation to Durban on the anti-racism conference, where the Dalits first were trying to gain attention and allies. And Paul would say, he's the one who said, we're people of the soil. We don't make special demands. We just want equal treatment. We want equal power within the political systems. We want the rights that have been promised to us. And so Paul is willing to listen to the other side. He wants to make his arguments. So I would say he's an exemplar of political humility, an actor who wants to act as one with political humility. And you might also think of, exemplars of humility. Of course, Gandhi was interpersonal humility. Was Gandhi political humility? It's not quite clear, because it wasn't until almost the very end of his life that he dropped this idea that the caste system was okay as long as you didn't treat anybody as though they were inferior. So it was okay to require some people to remove human feces by hand from these outdoor toilets that were still very common in rural India. You just couldn't say they were worth any less than an attorney or something. And anyway, Gandhi violated that norm because he was an attorney rather than a shopkeeper, which was his caste, as some of those folks pointed out. But so political humility is about treating each other as equals, about being willing to listen and not being arrogant or recalcitrant. So arrogant says, you don't have the right to speak to me. Recalcitrant says, yeah, you can speak. I'll pretend to listen, but I'm just going to do what I was going to do anyway. I'm not going to listen in good faith. So what we're after is a democratic system that promotes political humility, which is where people actually listen to each other. And if they won't listen to each other, we need a constitutional system where they're required to consider or at least act on others' reasons in court. That's why you get this neutral three-part court system where you've got a plaintiff, a defendant, and a neutral, hopefully neutral judge. And that's why I say we need this independent judiciary with powers of review. Can it really be independent? I don't know. The US is making me rethink that. But that would be the difference between arrogance and humility. And the last thing I'll say, the point of humility as it's being conceptualized today by philosophers and especially by social psychologists is that it shouldn't be associated with this virtue that was associated with Christianity that past philosophers really looked down on. So especially David Hume talked about humility as a cringing sort of virtue. Hume wanted you to stand up for yourself. Whereas these days, humility is viewed as a pro-social virtue. You want workers who are humble, who are willing to listen to others and be, they call it teamwork these days. But that's what we're looking at. So arrogance is not being willing to recognize the standing of others to speak. Recalcitrance is recognizing their standing but not listening to them. Humility is recognizing their standing and making a good faith effort to hear what they're saying. So hopefully that's more helpful. But Ambedkar was not a humble man. He was an angry man, and he talked about. He rejected the idea of dignity, even though it was in a couple of his documents, a couple of the proposed constitutions that he wrote. But in his own work, he rejected the idea of dignity because he saw it as a haughty virtue. So the upper castes, the Brahmins, would always claim their dignity had been violated anytime a Dalit wanted something for themselves. So, for example, when he came back from his studies, from getting his law degree and his 2 PhDs in the US and Britain, he tried to move into a lodging, place, apartment building, something like that, where he was going to work for the gentleman who had sponsored him, the Gaikwad of Baroda. And when they found out he was a Dalit, all these men with big sticks came and chased him around the place, trying to beat him until he had to leave. So that's what he was fighting against. And, their dignity had been offended by his presuming to move in there.
If I can just add to that, Louis, humility is truth. The truth of proportion, I would add. The truth of proportion. When I'm swollen, I'm arrogant. When I'm not swollen, there's the truth of my proportion to the cosmos around me, to you who sit next to me. It's the truth of proportion. I am not 6 feet tall and you're only 3 inches. That's arrogance. Even if it's physical or if it's psychological or spiritual. It's pomposity. When you're arrogant and when you see things in right proportion, that's humility. That's the earthiness, the humus. It's not a groveling thing at all.
That's great. Yeah, I think Hume was wrong.
So we'll go to Evan next. I'm sorry, Evan, you're on mute.
All powerful elites around the world engage in rationalizations for their status. And I think there's tremendous value in explicating what those rationalizations are and exposing them, disputing them. Of course, it's done most effectively by people within a culture, and those of us that are on the outside can certainly recognize and lift up their observations, but it's hard for us to initiate criticism of other cultures. So, here in the United States, I think our rationalization for elite dominance is really productivity, industrial or economic productivity, and it's horrific. But Mike, I have a question for you that I'm curious about. I don't see the word community being used anywhere in your book. I mean, this is a very salient term. I think it can be grounded in normative research, and it is grounded just in starting with in everyday interactions, and it's a very salient term that recognizes mutual obligations among people. So, is there a reason that you've avoided it?
I think I'm just deferring it to this current book. So it's it's a very good question. But it's I guess I'm framing it as a pathways question, because a lot of people in the 40s especially started talking about the need for global community. This was actually the realist critique. A scholar named Bill Schurman has done some nice work on the realist engagement with world government. And he's uncovered that actually a lot of these realists ended up as advocates of world government, at least once or twice they would let the mask slip. But the critique was always that you can't have a true global community, so you can't have world government. And one of the things I want to look into in this book are the bases for community. So my hope is that I can make a plausible case that you could have a community built around adherence to cherished ideals. So freedom, individual rights, democracy, that you can develop a global community, global political structures around that, rather than trying to say that we need some sort of global nation, that it's got to look like a global nation state where we develop that national identity. We've got a global flag and an anthem and other symbols that people feel loyal to and adhere to, and I just that doesn't seem like the way to the desired end to me. But I think my systematic work on that is ahead of me.
Virginia.
Thank you so much, Professor Cabrera, for your presence and your book. I would agree with you about community, that it's a prior step to world government. But my point was going to be asking you about the charter as it exists now is about state sovereignty and self-interest. And my understanding of how to be a change agent, you have to meet people where they are. You can't expect them to go this huge step to world government, especially with people who don't want to give up their power, which is, the whole problem with the Security Council and most nation states. But what would you say would be the interim steps for people to move from the self-interest to common interest?
No, that's the question for this next book. What are the steps we might advocate? And I don't have an answer fully worked out, but I've done a lot of the field research now, and I've been impressed by what's going on at the regional level. So my basic answer is we need more world government. And we need to advocate as much world government as we can, as much world federation, let's just call it world federation, as we can without threatening rights. So people will provocatively ask me sometimes, well, what is world government and how much do we need? How do we get there? And my answer is, well, we need as much as we could safely create. And by that I mean, let's not create a system that will immediately threaten individual rights instead of advance them. So, it's partly trial and error, but I think we've already done a lot of the trial and error as a species. So there's Ian Crawford at Birkbeck in London is London. It's a University of London institution is holding a session on world government, a workshop on world government, and it's open. I can send the information to Hannah if you're interested. You'd be able to come as an observer, to tune in as an observer. And the thing I'm presenting there is about regional organizations, because I've been going around talking to them. So I've done interviews now at the EU, but also the African Union, Mercosur in Latin America, and ASEAN, I may have mentioned last time. And I've been impressed by how much work has been done. And if those organizations could come close, not so much ASEAN, it's kind of an outlier, but come close to achieving their stated aims in their constitutional documents, we'd be a lot farther toward supranational government. And we're in terms of individual rights, which is the ball I think we need to keep our eye on once again, places like Mercosur have done pretty impressive things. So if you are a citizen of Mercosur, one of the 4 states or one of the 7, I think, associated states, you can move freely. So you have to ask permission, but it's routinely granted, and you can move, say, from Uruguay to Argentina to pursue educational or employment opportunities, just like the European Union. And this is, hundreds of millions of people, and it's a pretty impressive thing. So I think we have more world government than we think, to go back to the mantra that I introduced last time. And just supporting that and advancing that will go a long way toward helping us. United Nations is a tough one because we don't have a UN Parliamentary Assembly. Andreas did heroic work trying to get that in place. He was kind of thwarted, I think, ultimately by the Interparliamentary Union, which likes being the quote unquote parliamentary dimension of the United Nations, but is not really fulfilling that role. So I don't know what to say about the United Nations, except that it does an awful lot of work of the kind. It's got all the agencies you would want in a world government. They just need more funding and they need to be more strongly empowered to do their jobs. You know, if the UN, last thing, if the UN were allowed right now to do its humanitarian job in Gaza, there would not be starvation. Those people would be fed. And you know, it's how do you get around that?
Have you heard of the Middle Powers Initiative?
I'm familiar with Henry Usborne's proposal that way, but which one do you mean?
Douglas Roach.
Hmm.
He was a speaker here a while ago. He and some other prominent middle powers got together, and there was a political force that emerged quite remarkably. You might look into that.
Mhm, sure.
Joseph is going to that conference with Ian Crawford. I'm happy
Ah,
to.
great.
Yeah.
If
Great.
I
Yeah,
might add,
it's a good one. It's got the greatest hits, you know, all the rock stars of the academic world government world, or lots of them anyway. So it should be really good. Should be really good. I wish I could go in person.
if I might add to Virginia's wonderful question, I think one step is to the realization of the insight that difference is not necessarily competitive, but that difference can create a magnificent new unity. When that shift takes place, then there's a way to melt bias, because the question of my being different from you nationally, or different from you racially, or different from you gender-wise, or whatever, when that makes you in competition with me for honor, or etc., or money, or anything else, when that shifts to realize that that difference can make a marvelous, wonderful new tapestry, the game of resistance is over.
I have a quick question before we end our session. I am curious, how do we create positive movement forward in with Democratic World Federation when so many of our systems are still colored by the ideals of oppressive systems, whether that be steeped in colonialism or white supremacy or even the caste systems you've talked about? How do we move past that, but also talk about it more? Because it seems like this gets glossed over time and time again when it is a real problem. And I feel like it keeps us from moving forward as a society as a whole. And how do we overcome that and make positive change to achieve our goals?
No, it's a really good central question. For me, and again, I'm still doing the systematic research on this, but the answer I keep coming back to time and time again is more democracy. We need more democracy. The problem with more democracy is it seems to promote backlash. So in the United States, you know, we suddenly saw some empowerment of, say, the trans community, and you know, certain initiatives, and you know, political initiatives, and among others, and you know, we saw more and more racial equality, and other forms of equality, gender equality, were advancing. You know, not realized, but we're advancing. And then, you know, a couple of shocks, the global financial crisis, etc., and somebody like Trump gets in, and suddenly we're reversing faster than we ever thought possible. And you know, I think we're still reeling. We still trying to figure out what's happening to us. And you know, and I think the answer is, well, we just keep resisting where we can. And you know, maybe that means getting out in the street. I wish I were there to do the No Kings protest. And there and around the world, you know, India is facing the same sort of thing under its government. I think Trump is, or at least the people around him in some ways, are taking tips from people like Modi in India and Orban in Hungary, et cetera, et cetera. So democracy is on the back foot right now, but these pendulums swing. So we just have to keep pushing forward and saying, no, more democracy, more democracy. And I think, hopefully, it was so easy to write my thesis, which turned into my first book because it was around it came out in 2004. So I was writing it in 1999, 2000, when we were having the big World Trade Organization protests in Seattle. And, serious journalists were talking about, okay, world government, world democracy is coming. So let's just get ready for it. Here we go. Because so many people were pushing, saying, "You're deciding things for the world. Let us in, because we deserve a voice too." And it seemed like, okay, so you've got something to press on, you've got wedges to drive. We can make this thing happen. And then 9/11 happened, and it all seemed to fall apart. The world separated and shrank, and suddenly globalization was not at the tip of everybody's tongue. So I think these things do run in cycles, and we just have to keep in mind our ideals and what we're aiming for. And democracy is the first step, and that leads to the global democracy that we want. So not a happy answer, but it's where we are right now, unfortunately.
Well, that's a helpful answer too, because I mean, I'm 35, so I mean, I haven't been around that long, so still trying to figure out what to do and talking to my peers who are either my age or younger, and we're all kind of at this impasse of, well, what do we do next? So that's really helpful.
Yeah, we win the midterms.
Yeah. So Virginia, I'll let you go and then we'll wrap up. I've put a survey in the chat, so if you have time afterwards, it would be really helpful for us if you fill out the survey.
So my comment is to you, Hannah. I'm so grateful that you said how old you are, because the generations have to learn from one another. And without that, without your being here, it would be tragedy. I so believe in all of us learning from each other and how we're going to face this next phase of this world. Thank you so much, Hannah.
And thank you. And it's so nice to be with you all and hear your perspectives and have these conversations.